Chapter 25. Certainly, all of Cannery Row and probably all of Monterey felt that a change had come. It's all right not to believe in luck and omens. Nobody believes in them. But it doesn't do any good to take chances with them, and no one takes chances. Cannery Row, like every place else, is not superstitious, but will not walk under a ladder or open an umbrella in the house. Doc was a pure scientist and incapable of superstition, and yet when he came in late one night and found a line of white flowers across the doorsill, he had a bad time of it. But most people in Cannery Row simply do not believe in such things, and then live by them. There was no doubt in Mac's mind that a dark cloud had hung on the palace flophouse. He had analyzed the abortive party and found that a misfortune had crept into every crevice, that bad luck had come up like hives on the evening. And once you got into a routine like that, the best thing to do was just to go to bed until it was over. You couldn't buck it. Not that Mac was superstitious. Now a kind of gladness began to penetrate into the row and to spread out from there. Doc was almost supernaturally successful with a series of lady visitors. He didn't have to try. The puppy at the palace was growing like a pole bean, and having 1,000 generations of training behind her, she began to train herself. She got disgusted with wetting on the floor and took to going outside. It was obvious that Darling was going to grow up a good and charming dog. And she had developed no chorea from her distemper. The benignant influence crept like gas through the row. It got as far as Herman's hamburger stand. It spread to the San Carlos Hotel. Jimmy Brucia felt it, and Johnny, his singing bartender. Sparky Evia felt it, and joyously joined battle with the 3 new out-of-town cops. It even got as far as the county jail in Salinas, where Gay, who had lived a good life by letting the sheriff beat him at checkers, suddenly grew cocky and never lost another game. He lost his privileges that way, but he felt a whole man again. The sea lions felt it, and their barking took on a tone and a cadence that would have gladdened the heart of St. Francis. Little girls, studying their catechism, suddenly looked up and giggled for no reason at all. Perhaps some electrical finder could have been developed so delicate that could have located the source of all the spreading joint fortune, and triangulation might possibly have located it in the palace flophouse and grill. Certainly the palace was lousy with it. Mac and the boys were charged. Jones was seen to leap from his chair, only to do a quick tap dance and sit down again. Hazel smiled vaguely at nothing at all. The joy was so general and so suffused that Mac had a hard time keeping it centered and aimed at its objective. Eddie, who had worked at La Ida pretty regularly, was accumulating a cellar of some promise. He no longer added beer to the winning jug. It gave a flat taste to the mixture, he said. Sam Malloy had planted morning glories to grow over the boiler. He had put out a little awning, and under it he and his wife often sat in the evening. She was crocheting a bedspread. The joy even got into the bear flag. Business was good. Phyllis May's leg was knitting nicely, and she was nearly ready to go to work again. Eva Flanagan got back from East St. Louis very glad to be back. It had been hot in East St. Louis, and it hadn't been as fine as she remembered it. But then she had been younger when she had had so much fun there. The knowledge or conviction about the party for Doc was no sudden thing. It did not burst out full-blown. People knew about it, but let it grow gradually like a pupa in the cocoons of their imaginations. Mac was realistic about it. Last time we forced her, he told the boys. You can't never give a good party that way. You gotta let her creep up on you. Well, when's it gonna be? Jones asked impatiently. I don't know, said Mac. Is it gonna be a surprise party? Hazel asked. It ought to, that's the best kind, said Mac. Darling brought him a tennis ball she had found, and he threw it out the door into the weeds. She bounced away after it. Hazel said, If we knew when was Doc's birthday, we could give him a birthday party. Mac's mouth was open. Hazel constantly surprised him. By God, Hazel, you got something, he cried. Yes, sir. If it was his birthday, there'd be presents. That's just the thing. All we got to find out is when it is. That ought to be easy, said Hughie. Why don't we just ask him? Hell, said Mac, then he'd catch on. You ask a guy when his birthday, and especially if you've already given a party like we done, and he'll know what you want to know for. Maybe I'll just go over and smell around a little and not let on. I'll go with you, said Hazel. No, if 2 of us went, he might figure we were up to something. Well, hell, it was my idea, said Hazel. I know, said Mac, and when it comes off, why, I'll tell Doc it was your idea, but I think I better go over alone. How is he? How is he? Friendly? Eddie asked. Sure, he's all right. Mac found Doc way back in the downstairs part of the laboratory. He was dressed in a long rubber apron, and he wore rubber gloves to protect his hands from the formaldehyde. He was injecting the veins and arteries of small dogfish with color mass. His little ball mill rolled over and over, mixing the blue mass. The red fluid was already in the pressure gun. Doc's fine hands worked precisely, slipping the needle into place and pressing the compressed air trigger that forced the color into the veins. He laid the finished fish in a neat pile. He would have to go over these again to put the blue mass in the arteries. The dogfish made good dissection specimens. Hi, Doc, said Mac. Keeping pretty busy. Busy as I want, said Doc. How's the pup? Doing just fine. She would have died if it hadn't been for you. For a moment, a wave of caution went over Doc and then slipped off. Ordinarily, a compliment made him wary. He had been dealing with Mac for a long time, but the tone had nothing but gratefulness in it. He knew how Mac felt about the pup. How are things going up at the palace? Fine, Doc, just fine. We got 2 new chairs. I wish you'd come up and see us. It's pretty nice up there now. I will, said Doc. Eddie still bring back the jug? Sure, said Mac. He ain't putting beer in it no more, and I think the stuff is better. It's got more zip. It had plenty of zip before, said Doc. Mac waited patiently. Sooner or later, Doc was going to wade into it, and he was waiting. If Doc seemed to open the subject himself, it would be less suspicious. This was always Mac's method. Haven't seen Hazel for some time. He isn't sick, is he? No, said Mac, and he opened the campaign. Hazel is all right. Him and Huey are having one hell of a battle. Been going on for a week, he chuckled. And the funny thing is, it's about something they don't neither of them know nothing about. I stayed out of it because I don't know nothing about it neither. But not them. They've even got a little mad at each other. What's it about? Doc asked. Well, sir, said Mac, Hazel's all the time buying these here charts and looking up lucky days and stars and stuff like that. And Huey says all a bunch of malarkey. Huey, he says if you know when a guy is born, you can tell about him. And Huey says they're just selling Hazel them charts for 2 bits apiece. Me? I don't know nothing about it. What do you think, Doc? I'd kind of side with Huey, said Doc. He stopped the ball mill, washed out the color gun, and filled it with blue mass. They got going hot the other night, said Mac. They asked me when I'm born, so I tell 'em April 12. And Hazel, he goes and buys one of them charts and read all about me. Well, it did seem to hit in some places, but it was nearly all good stuff, and a guy will believe good stuff about himself. It said I'm brave and smart and kind to my friends, but Hazel says it's all true. When's your birthday, Doc? At the end of the long discussion, it sounded perfectly casual. You couldn't put your finger on it, but it must be remembered that Doc had known Mac a very long time. If he had not, he would have said December 18, which was his birthday, instead of October 27, which was not. October 27, said Doc. Ask Hazel what that makes me. It's probably so much malarkey, said Mac, but Hazel, he takes it serious. I'll ask him to look you up, Doc. When Mac left, Doc wondered casually what the build-up was, for he had recognized it as a lead. He knew Mac's technique, his method. He recognized his style, and he wondered to what purpose Mac could put the information. It was only later, when rumors began to creep in, that Doc added the whole thing up. Now he felt slightly relieved, for he had expected Mac to put the bite on him. Chapter 26. The 2 boys played in the boatworks yard until a cat climbed the fence. Instantly they gave chase, drove it across the tracks, and there filled their pockets with granite stones from the roadbed. The cat got away from them in the tall weeds, but they kept the stones because they were perfect in weight, shape, and size for throwing. You can't ever tell when they're going to need a stone like that. They turned toward Cannery Row and wanged a stone at the corrugated iron front of Morton's cannery. A startled man looked out the office window and then rushed for the door, but the boys were too quick for him. They were lying behind a wooden stringer in the lot before he even got near the door. He couldn't have found them in 100 years. I bet he could look all his life and he couldn't find us, said Joey. They got tired of hiding after a while with no one looking for them. They got up and strolled on down Cannery Row. They looked a long time in Lee's window, coveting the pliers, the hacksaws, the engineers' caps, and the bandanas. Then they crossed the street and sat down on a lower step of the stairs that went to the second story of the laboratory. Joey said, You know, this guy in here got babies in bottles. What kind of babies? Willard asked. Regular babies, only before they're born. I don't believe it, said Willard. Well, it's true. The Sprague kid's seen them, and he says they ain't no bigger than this, and they got little hands and feet and eyes. And hair? Willard demanded. Well, the Sprague kid didn't say about hair. You should have asked him. I think he's a liar. You better not tell him hear you say that, said Joey. Well, you can tell him if I said it. Tell him I said it. I ain't afraid of him, and I ain't afraid of you. I ain't afraid of anybody. You want to make something of it? Joey didn't answer. Well, do you? No, said Joey. I was just thinking. Why don't we just go up and ask the guy if he's got babies in bottles? Maybe he'd show them to us. That is, if he's got any. He ain't here, said Willard. When he's here, his car's here. He's away someplace. I think it's a lie. I think the Sprague kid is a liar. I think you're a liar. You want to make something of that? It was a lazy day. Willard was going to have to work hard to get up any excitement. I think you're a coward, too. You want to make something of that? Joey didn't answer. Willard changed his tactics. Where's your old man now? He said in a conversational tone. He's dead, said Joey. Oh, yeah? I didn't hear. What'd he die of? For a moment, Joey was silent. He knew Willard knew, but he couldn't let on he knew. Not without fighting Willard, and Joey was afraid of Willard. He he killed himself. Yeah? Willard put on a long face. How'd he do that? He took rat poison. Willard's voice shrieked with laughter. What do you think, he was a rat? Joey chuckled a little at the joke, just enough, that is. He must have thought he was a rat, Willard cried. Did he go crawling around like this? Look, Joey, like this? Did he wrinkle up his nose like this? Did he have a big, old, long tail? Willard was helpless with laughter. Why didn't he just get a rat trap and put his head in it? They laughed themselves out on that one. Willard really wore it out. Then he probed for another joke. What did he look like when he took it? Like this? He crossed his eyes and opened his mouth and stuck out his tongue. He was sick all day, said Joey. He didn't die till the middle of the night. It hurt him, Willard said. What'd he do it for? He couldn't get a job, said Joey. Nearly a year he couldn't get a job. And you know the funny thing? The next morning a guy come around to give him a job. Willard tried to recapture his joke. I guess he just figured he was a rat, he said, but it fell through even for Willard. Joey stood up and put his hands in his pockets. He saw a little coppery shine in the gutter and walked toward it, but just as he reached it, Willard shoved him aside and picked up the penny. I saw it first, Joey cried. It's mine. You want to try and make something of it? Said Willard. Why don't you go take some rat poison? Chapter 27. Mac and the boys, the virtues, the beatitudes, the beauties, they sat in the palace flop house, and they were the stone dropped in the pool, the impulse which sent up ripples to all of Cannery Row and beyond, to Pacific Grove, to Monterey, even over the hill to Carmel. This time, said Mac, we gotta be sure he gets to the party. If he don't get there, we don't give it. Where are we going to give it this time? Jones asked. Mac tipped his chair back against the wall and hooked his feet around the front legs. I've given that a lot of thought, he said. Of course we could give it here, but it would be pretty hard to surprise him here. And Doc likes his own place. He's got his music there. Mac scowled around the room. I don't know who broke his phonograph last time, he said, but if anybody so much as lays a finger on it next time, I personally will kick the hell out of him. I guess we'll just have to give it at his place, said Huey. People didn't get the news of the party. The knowledge of it just slowly grew up in them, and no one was invited. Everyone was going. October 27 had a mental red circled around it, and since it was to be a birthday party, there were presents to be considered. Take the girls at Dora's. All of them had at one time or another gone over to laboratory for advice or medicine, or simply for unprofessional company. And they had seen Doc's bed. It was covered with an old faded red blanket full of foxtails and burrs and sand, for he took it on all his collecting trips. If money came in, he bought laboratory equipment. It never occurred to him to buy a new blanket for himself. Dora's girls were making him a patchwork quilt, a beautiful thing of silk. And since most of the silk available came from underclothing and evening dresses, the quilt was glorious in strips of flesh pink and orchid and pale yellow and cerise. They worked on it in the late mornings and the afternoons before the boys from the sardine fleet came in. Under the community of effort, those fights and ill feelings that always are present in a whorehouse completely disappeared. Li Chong got out and inspected a 25-foot string of firecrackers and a big bag of China lily bulbs. These, to his way These, to his way of thinking, were the finest things you could have for a party. Sam Malloy had long had a theory of antiques. He knew that old furniture and glass and crockery, which had not been very valuable in its day, had when time went by taken on desirability and cash value out of all proportion to its beauty or utility. He knew of one chair that had brought $500. Sam collected pieces of historic automobiles, and he was convinced that someday in his collection, after making him very rich, would repose on black velvet in the best museums. Sam gave the party a good deal of thought, and then he went over his treasures, which he kept in a big locked box behind the boiler. He decided to give Doc one of his finest pieces, the connecting rod and piston from a 1916 Chalmers. He rubbed and polished this beauty until it gleamed like a piece of ancient armor. He made a little box for it and lined it with black cloth. Mac and the boys gave the problem considerable thought and came to the conclusion that Doc always wanted cats and had some trouble getting them. Mac brought out his double cage. They borrowed a female in an interesting condition and set their trap under the cypress tree at the top of the vacant lot. In the corner of the palace they built a wire cage, and in their collection of angry tomcats grew with every night. Jones had to make 2 trips a day to the canneries for fish heads to feed their charges. Mac considered, and correctly, that 25 tomcats would be as nice a present as they could give Doc. "No decorations this time," said Mac. "Just a good, solid party, with lots of liquor." Gay heard about the party clear over in the Salinas jail, and he made a deal with the sheriff to get off that night and borrowed $2 from him for a round-trip bus ticket. Gay had been very nice to the sheriff, who wasn't a man to forget, particularly because election was coming up, and Gay could, or said he could, swing quite a few votes. Besides, Gay could give the Salinas jail a bad name if he wanted to. Henry had suddenly decided that the old-fashioned pincushion was an art form which had flowered and reached its peak in the 90s and had since been neglected. He revived the form and was delighted to see what could be done with colored pins. The picture was never completed. You could change it by rearranging the pins. He was preparing a group of these pieces for a one-man show when he heard about the party, and he instantly abandoned his own work and began a giant pincushion for Doc. It was to be an intricate and provocative design in green, yellow, and blue pins, all cool colors, and its title was Precambrian Memory. Henry's friend Eric, a learned barber who collected the first editions of writers, who never had a second edition or a second book, decided to give Doc a rowing machine he had got at the bankruptcy proceedings of a client, with a 3-year barber bill. The rowing machine was in fine condition. No one had rowed it much. No one ever uses a rowing machine. The conspiracy grew, and there were endless visits, back and forth, discussion of presents, of liquor, of what time will we start, and nobody must tell Doc. Doc didn't know when he first became aware that something was going on that concerned him. In Lee Chong's, conversation stopped when he entered. At first, it seemed to him that people were cold to him. When at least half a dozen people asked him what he was doing October 27, he was puzzled, for he had forgotten he had given this date as his birthday. Actually, he had been interested in the horoscope for a spurious birth date, but Mac had never mentioned it again, and so Doc forgot it. One evening, he stopped in at the halfway house because they had a draft beer he liked and kept it at the right temperature. He gulped his first glass and then settled down to enjoy his second when he heard a drunk talking to the bartender. "You going to the party?" "What party?" "Well," said the drunk confidentially, "you know Doc down in Cannery Row?" The bartender looked up at the bar and then back. "Well," said the drunk, "they're giving him a hell of a party on his birthday." "Who is?" "Everybody." Doc mulled this over. He did not know the drunk at all. His reaction to the idea was not simple. He felt a great warmth that they should want to give him a party, and at the same time he quaked inwardly, remembering the last one they had given. Now everything fell into place. Max questioned into the silences when he was about. He thought of it a lot that night, sitting beside his desk. He glanced about, considering what things would have to be locked up. He knew the party was going to cost him plenty. The next day he began making his own preparations for the party. His best records he carried into the back room where they could be locked away. He moved every bit of equipment that was breakable back there, too. He knew how it would be. His guests would be hungry, and they wouldn't bring anything to eat. They would run out of liquor early. They always did. A little warily, he went up to the thrift market, where there was a fine and understanding butcher. They discussed meat for some time. Doc ordered 15 pounds of steaks, 10 pounds of tomatoes, 12 heads of lettuce, 6 loaves of bread, a big jar of peanut butter and one of strawberry jam, 5 gallons of wine, and 4 quarts of a good, substantial, but not distinguished whiskey. He knew he would have trouble at the bank the first of the month. 3 or 4 such parties, he thought, he would lose a laboratory. Meanwhile, on the Row, the planning reached a crescendo. Doc was right. No one thought of food, but there were odd pints and quarts put away all over. The collection of presents was growing, and the guest list, if there had been one, was a little like a census. At the Bear Flag, a constant discussion went on about what to wear. Since they would not be working, the girls did not want to wear the long, beautiful dresses, which were their uniforms. They decided to wear street clothes. It wasn't as simple as it sounded. Dora insisted that a skeleton crew remain on duty to take care of the regulars. The girls divided up into shifts, some to stay until they were relieved by others. They had to flip for who would go to the party first. The first ones would see Doc's face when they gave him the beautiful quilt. They had it on a frame in the dining room, and it was nearly finished. Mrs. Malloy had put aside her bedspread for a while. She was crocheting 6 doilies for Doc's beer glasses. The first excitement was gone from the Row now, and its place was taken by a deadly, cumulative earnestness. There were 15 tomcats in the cage at the Palace Flophouse, and their yowling made Darling a little nervous at night. Chapter 28. Sooner or later, Frankie was bound to hear about the party, for Frankie drifted about like a small cloud. He was always on the edge of groups. No one noticed him or paid any attention to him. You couldn't tell whether he was listening or not. But Frankie did hear about the party, and he heard about the presents, and a feeling of fullness swelled in him, and a feeling of sick longing. In the window of Jacob's jewelry store was the most beautiful thing in the world. It had been there a long time. It was a black onyx clock, with a gold face, but on top of it was the real beauty. On top was a bronze group, St. George killing the dragon. The dragon was on his back with his claws in the air, and his breast was St. George's spear. The saint was in full armor, with the visor raised, and he rode a fat, big buttocked horse. With his spear, he pinned the dragon to the ground. But the wonderful thing was that he wore a pointed beard, and he looked a little like Doc. Frankie walked to Alvarado Street several times a week to stand in front of the window and to look at this beauty. He dreamed about it, too, dreamed of running his fingers over the rich, smooth bronze. He had known about it for months when he heard of the party and the presents. Frankie stood on the sidewalk for an hour before he went inside. "Well," said Mr. Jacobs. He had given Frankie a visual frisk as he came in, and he knew there wasn't 75 cents on him. "How much is that?" Frankie asked huskily. "What?" "That." "You mean the clock?" $50. With the group, $75. Frankie walked out without replying. He went down to the beach and crawled under an overturned rowboat and peeked out at the little waves. The bronze beauty was so strong in his head that it seemed to stand out in front of him, and a frantic, trapped feeling came over him. He had to get the beauty. His eyes were fierce when he thought of it. He stayed under the boat all day, and at night he emerged and went back to Alvarado Street. While people went to the movies and came out and went to the Golden Poppy, he walked up and down the block, and he didn't get tired or sleepy, for the beauty burned in him like fire. At last, the people thinned out and gradually disappeared from the streets, and the parked cars drove away and the town settled to sleep. A policeman looked closely at Frankie. "What you doing out?" he asked. Frankie took to his heels and fled around the corner and hid behind a barrel in the alley. At 2:30, he crept to the door of Jacob's and tried the knob. It was locked. Frankie went back to the alley and sat behind the barrel and thought. He saw a broken piece of concrete lying beside the barrel and picked it up. The policeman reported that he heard the crash and ran to it. Jacob's window was broken. He saw the prisoner walking rapidly away and chased him. He didn't know how the boy could run that far and that fast, carrying 50 pounds of clock and bronze, but the prisoner nearly got away. If he had not blundered into a blind street, he would have got away. The chief called Doc the next day. "Come on down, will you? I want to talk to you." They brought Frankie in very dirty and frowsy. His eyes were red, but he held his mouth firm, and he even smiled a little welcome when he saw Doc. "What's the matter, Frankie?" Doc asked. "He broke into Jacobs's last night," the chief said. "Stole some stuff. We got in touch with his mother. She says it's not her fault because he hangs around your place all the time." "Frankie, you shouldn't have done it," said Doc. "The heavy stone of Inevitability was on his heart. "Can't you parole him to me?" Doc asked. "I don't think the judge will do it," said the chief. "We've got a mental report. You know what's wrong with him?" "Yes," said Doc, "I know." "And you know what's likely to happen when he comes into puberty." "Yes," said Doc, "I know," and the stone weighed terribly on his heart. "The doctor thinks we better put him away. We couldn't before, but now he's got a felony on him. I think we better." As Frankie listened, the welcome died in his eyes. "What did he take?" Doc asked. "A great big clock and a bronze statue. I'll pay for it." "Oh, we got it back. I don't think the judge will hear of it. It'll just happen again, you know that." "Yes," said Doc softly, "I know, but maybe he had a reason." "Frankie," he said, "why did you take it?" Frankie looked a long time at him. "I love you," he said. Doc ran out and got in his car and went collecting in the caves below Point Lobos.